Hello, welcome everyone to our tomato basics class and growing for the Slow Garden Center. My name is Taylor. I'll be moderating this class today, as well as our speaker, who is Dan Alexander, who does a wonderful job talking about all the different veggies that we've had over many years. So if you would like to watch other videos from us, go onto our YouTube page and look down and see what else we have. But enjoy our class today on tomato basics, and I'll see you on the other side of this.
Thank you, Taylor, and welcome everybody. Always fun to talk about tomatoes in April. I was just looking at the weather app on my phone and reminding myself that the nights are still quite cold, and tomatoes love the Bay Area, but the Bay Area doesn't always love tomatoes, and especially tomatoes struggle a little bit with our cool nights. So although April is definitely the best time to select and to get your tomatoes home, and we'll talk about what to do with them in a few minutes, but it's not always the best time for them to grow fast and thrive, because they stall out every evening when the temperature drops down to about 50 degrees. And so we'll talk about some techniques for helping you sort of baby them along at the beginning here. The reason I say this is the best time to select them is that this is when they're all available and they're fresh. And although tomatoes will continue to be available probably into the early part of June, there won't be the selection by then, and some of them won't look nearly as fresh by then. Some of them may have been sitting in your local nursery for quite a time by the time June rolls around. So sometime in April to early May is an excellent time to have the best selection and the freshest plants for you to get started with. I tend to bring in mostly organic starts here I'm in Mill Valley on Miller Avenue, and my bias is toward organic starts for many reasons, but so I also bring in conventionally grown starts, especially a little later in the season when some of the organic growers start to run out of varieties, and we always want to have the most popular varieties available for you, and we'll talk about what some of those are. Tomatoes are one of our fabulous New World vegetables, which originated here in the Western Hemisphere in South America, and were developed to their edible state probably in Mexico a long time ago. And they're the sort of thing where every valley and village would have a tomato that everybody grew, and over the years they would select for flavor and for disease resistance and for capacity to make lots of tomatoes. And so each place would have what we now call a land race of tomatoes that would be their tomato. And some of the heirloom tomatoes are kind of like that, in that they developed over time with people just selecting them for flavor and for the ability to grow them in their area and that sort of thing. And they were grown from seed year after year until they became reliable plants that would come back and give you the same tomatoes year after year. And then after a while, people started hybridizing tomatoes, which simply means they took the pollen from one nice tomato that had a characteristic they liked and put it in the flower of another tomato that had maybe a different characteristic that they liked, and then grew out the seeds that grew from that and said, did I get something better or did I not get something better? And by trial and error and experimentation, you come up with hybrid tomatoes that have sometimes better vigor, sometimes disease resistance. But what's important to know is that this is not genetic modification. These are not GMO plants. Hybrids are simply naturally occurring genetic combinations that would happen if a bee from a San Marzano tomato came over and pollinated a brandywine tomato, and you grew the seed out from whatever resulted from that. You would have a naturally occurring hybrid. So these are not GMO plants, and there's no reason to be afraid of hybrids. Heirlooms are defined as open pollinated plants, which means that they're allowed to freely pollinate. And so to have a seed bank of, again, I'll use brandywine as an example, you have to grow a gigantic field of brandywine so that you can be pretty sure that brandywine is pollinizing brandywine, and you'll end up with a brandywine seed for next year. Heirlooms also are defined as being a certain age, and you'll find different definitions, but I think most of them require about 50 years. So a hybrid tomato, by definition, is not an heirloom because it's not open pollinated. And a new variety, even if it is open pollinated, is not an heirloom by definition unless it's been around for 50 years. So these are terms that are good to understand, but they shouldn't really limit you too much in how you approach growing your tomatoes. I suppose the other significant terms are organically grown or conventionally grown. And organically grown means that the farmer, the grower, is only using inputs that are listed as acceptable for organic gardening, and they're not using synthetic fertilizers, and they're not using pesticides other than those which are relatively benign, like oils and soaps, and a few fungicides that are actually bacteria that are listed for organic gardening. And so you can be relatively certain that there are not pesticide residues on organically grown plants. There may be a few on conventionally grown plants, but for the most part, the growers, at least that we deal with and buy conventionally grown tomatoes from, don't use much in the way of sprays. They may occasionally use a growth regulator if the tomatoes are getting gigantic. The organic growers will never use a growth regulator. That's a little bit of terminology. The other thing we'll talk about are a relatively new group of tomato plants that we've been getting into the trade, which are grafted tomatoes. And those are becoming quite popular, and I'll explain why and what to look for there as well. We always want to ask the question, is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? And the easy answer is yes, it is. And botanically, it's a fruit. It's the swollen ovary of a flower, which has the seeds inside of it. Botanically, the idea of that fruit is that it will be eaten by one or more animals, pass through the digestive tract, the animals wandering far away from the parent plant, and will deposit the seeds with some natural fertilizer someplace, and the tomato plant will spread that way, and probably did originally. Whatever the original wild ancestor for a tomato is long gone. Nobody knows what it is. It does not exist any longer. Unlike peppers, say, where the original ancestors are still alive in the world. But undoubtedly, it was a little tiny fruit that looks like the fruit of a potato vine or a potato plant, for that matter, to which tomatoes are closely related. And it was like a little berry and had the seeds inside it. Some animal was able to eat it and pass it through their gut and spread it around. The fact that tomatoes are closely related to potatoes brings up an interesting little, I guess, sort of just funny thing about tomatoes, is that they have two different kinds of leaves depending on the variety. Most of them have what we call a tomato leaf, which is this kind of finely cut leaf that looks like this. And you'll see most of these over here have that same leaf. And then occasionally there'll be a variety. This is Stupice, which has a little different looking leaf that has a big kind of front leaf and smaller leaves behind it, and it's not as finely cut as what we call the tomato leaf. So Stupice, Brandywine, Visitation Valley are all varieties that have a potato leaf. There's no particular meaning to that other than that you can identify the difference in how they look. I had an entire rack of tomatoes blown over in one of these storms we had recently, and many of them lost their labels. And the only ones that I was able to put the labels back into were the Visitation Valleys, which have the potato leaf. The rest are all out in a flat, waiting to make tomatoes so we can figure out what they are. Now, if any of you were at the talk I did on growing potatoes, I want to just show you what the potatoes look like now. This is the 15-gallon pot of potatoes, and these are the fortunately I labeled
When did we
them
do? Yeah.
the banana potato, and this was February 10th that these were planted. And you can see how similar they look to tomato. You might even mistake them for tomatoes if you were just walking by. So by now we've filled up the pot with dirt. The potatoes were planted down about 8 inches from the bottom, I think 6 inches from the bottom, and they're growing wonderfully. And it reminds me that a few years ago a product was available to us. I got a few in, called ketchup and fries, which was a tomato grafted onto a potato plant. So the idea was you could pick the tomatoes from the top and then you could dig the potatoes out of the soil. Pretty gimmicky, if you ask me, but it shows you how closely related they are because they can actually graft together and grow just fine. Tomatoes have several characteristics that we can kind of group together to talk about, and one of them is what we call days to ripen. That's important here in the Bay Area because I mentioned earlier, we do not have perfect tomato weather here. Perfect tomato weather, the nights would hover around 60 to 65 degrees, and the days would be between 75 and 80 degrees. That would be heaven for tomatoes, and then they would churn along day and night and ripen up the fruit really quickly and sweetly and just do really well. Well, our nights here, even in midsummer, are closer to 50 degrees. And below 55 degrees, tomatoes tend to sort of put the brakes on and everything their metabolism kind of shuts down. And so once that night temperature gets down there close below 55, they're resting and they have to wait for the daytime temperature to warm up again for them to start the process of making and ripening tomatoes. So we tend to do best in the Bay Area with tomatoes that have a relatively short days to ripening. And that means, I think the very fastest advertised days to ripening that you'll find on a tomato is about 55 days. And the very longest can be close to 100 days. And that's a big difference, especially when you factor in the stoppage time. I'll use a soccer analogy. When the referees keeping the time in a soccer game, they add on time when there are injuries or fake injuries or whatever we have in the game. So by the time the 90 minutes or the 45 minutes of the half is over, there might be 2 or 3 or 5 minutes that they're going to add on to that half. Well, with tomatoes, we have to add stoppage time to the advertised length of ripening. So if I randomly take a tomato here, which is Heirloom Marriage Genuine, and I look on the tag, and hopefully it'll tell me, it says 80 to 100 days to ripen. Now that's a fairly late tomato because it's a great big tomato. But we're going to have to add stoppage time for the fact that the nights are cold, and sometimes our days are a little too hot even in the summer. So that 80 to 100 days is really going to be more like 90 to 120 days, depending on the temperature. If you're in San Francisco, you're going to add more time than if you're in Pleasanton. Pleasanton has something more approaching good night temperatures, but they have the disability of having daytime temperatures that are too hot for tomatoes. So there is a constant guessing game going on about how long will my tomatoes take to ripen. And there is no precise calculator that will tell you that. You just have to know that it'll be in a range, that it'll be not sooner than the days to ripening on the tag, and it will undoubtedly be quite a bit longer than that. The cherry tomatoes, that's the little tomatoes, like Sun Gold and Super Sweet 100 and Sweet Million and Mount Vesuvius. I mean, there are literally hundreds of them. They will almost always ripen successfully for you here in the Bay Area without any problem. The next size tomato is what I call a small slicer. And that would be like Stupice and Beaver Lodge Slicer. They will ripen in about 60 days according to the tag, which might mean 70 days in reality. And they're always pretty reliable as well. And then the third size would be what I call a regular slicer, that big. And that would be Early Girl and New Girl and Dirty Girl and Petaluma Hill Purple and lots of other ones. And those are going to be 75, somewhere between 70 and 80 days on the tag, and more than that in reality. But they'll ripen up reliably for you as well. And then when you get to sort of the fourth level, then we're going to take places like right on the coast and right on the bay and the western part of San Francisco, and say, you're a little too cold really to have good success with those fourth level tomatoes. I mean, this is Black Krim, Julia Child, Michael Pollan, Berkeley tie-dye, many, but they're just getting a little bit too big and take too long for you to have reliable success. Here's why. The longer the tomato is in the ground or in the container that you're growing it in, the more it's exposed to insects, funguses, bacterial diseases, and the longer the tomato takes to ripen, the longer the plant has to keep growing to sustain it. It's also struggling every night when those temperatures go down. And so the skins on the tomatoes get thicker. You're not going to have a big tomato with a nice thin skin, probably anywhere in the Bay Area, because it takes so much longer to ripen. The skin gets thicker. The flavor can still be wonderful, but you won't have that delicate kind of skin that kind of disappears, that you don't notice when you're eating it, usually around here on a bigger tomato. And so if I'm in one of the cooler climates, I want to stick to the cherries and the small to medium size slicers to be happy. And it's not to say you shouldn't try one gigantic tomato just for the heck of it, but you really are going to have better success with smaller, quicker tomatoes. And on the other hand, if I'm in one of the really warmer climates, if I'm in Nevada or I'm in Contra Costa County, then I can have more confidence that my larger tomatoes are to eventually ripen up okay, and they won't take as long as they would right on the coast or on the water somewhere. Look at the variety description. Usually the tag will tell you the good information. You can also get some piece of information that you just out of the name of the tomato. I think the tomato with the very best name, probably from a commercial point of view, is San Francisco Fog. That's evocative of a tomato that should be able to grow in a cool climate, and in fact, it can. Now, the fact that it's relatively flavorless, that's not the name's fault, but it is an excellent tomato to grow in cooler weather, but it's not the tastiest. I would say Stupice is probably which looks like stupis, by the way.
I know, I always call it
spelled stupis, but I think it's pronounced Stupice. Stupice. It is a fabulous tomato for cooler climates, very reliable. It's been grown for years along the coast and is very flavorful. But San Francisco Fog has the best name. You can also get good clues from names that sound like Eastern European origin, because Eastern Europe suffers from the same kinds of cold nights that we have and a relatively short growing season. And so a tomato like Moscovich tells you a little bit about where it probably came from and is worth a try. And it'll turn out that most of those tomatoes in their description will say they're relatively short period tomatoes. So they'll be 60 to 70 days, somewhere in that time frame. So it's a little clue to look for. Some of the tomatoes will be marked with a V or an F or a VF or a VFT. These are signals that they have been bred. They'll always be a hybrid that says that. They've been bred to be resistant to certain diseases. V is a fungal disease called verticillium wilt. F is fusarium wilt, another fungal disease. The T is tobacco mosaic virus. These are Fusarium and verticillium are problems that you can run into. They're soil-borne funguses that will slowly kill the plant. So if you've ever had a problem that you think might be one of those, then looking for a resistant plant to plant in the future is a good idea. It's also a good idea to rotate crops. That's not easy to do always in a home garden setting. We can't plant the front 40 in tomatoes one year and the back 40 the next year usually. But we can, at least if you have a garden plot, you can grow the tomatoes on the front end of the plot one year and the back end of the plot the next year, and that'll be worth something. Also, you can keep a close eye on your plants and not let diseased plants linger in your garden. Be fairly ruthless about getting rid of sick plants because they could affect your next year's and your year after that if they've got something that can stay in the soil. And they can also affect your neighbors, which is not a nice thing. So be a little bit ruthless about pulling out plants that get sick. And that does happen from time to time. And sometimes it's not even anything that will spread, but you don't have the ability at home to figure out exactly what's affecting the plants. So be safe rather than sorry. And if a plant's not thriving, our season is so long that, get rid of the plant and start another one. We have until October to keep harvesting tomatoes around here. That's one of the wonderful things about the climate. And often our climate actually improves in September, October, when the marine layer backs off and it's not as cold at night and the days are still plenty warm and long. And so we get some of our best tomato harvests late in the season. So if you have a plant or two that you start out in the spring and they go for a month or something, and then they start to look nasty, I say chuck them and get a new one. $5 for a tomato plant. I'm not saying $5 is nothing, but it's small enough amount that you can replace a plant if you need to without worrying about it too much. And you'll get more than $5 worth of tomatoes and more than $10 worth of tomatoes at today's prices, especially if you're buying organic tomatoes at the market. Now let's talk a little bit about branching or suckers. This is always a question that comes up. And I think it's because there are people out there that advocate you remove all the suckers below the first flowers on a tomato plant. And I'm going to take one of the larger ones here because it's a little easier to see what we're talking about. Every place where a leaf comes out of a tomato stem, a branch is going to grow. And this is the branch right here. And you can see one here and one here. They will grow out of every branch. Now this tomato hasn't flowered yet. It is making some flowers here. These are the buds. Now this one's starting to color up a little bit. The flowers are yellow when they bloom. A person who advocates sucker removal would remove all of these. They would just tear them off like that and throw them away so that you'd have no suckers coming out until this flower happened.
Which is like 8 inches or 6 inches.
Even these would come off, right? Correct. Now, I am not a sucker removal advocate. I think there's absolutely no reason to do that. The only reason to remove the branches is if the tomato is growing in a direction that you don't want. Maybe you've had to grow it right next to some other vegetables that need to get some sunlight, and there's a tomato branch that's growing out over them. Then take it off. It's going to make lots more branches. That's not a problem. But I don't think I've never seen any science that suggests that there's a reason to remove these branches, and every one of them is going to end up flowering and making tomatoes, just like this main branch is doing. So my recommendation is don't worry about it, and just let the tomato grow. If it's a tomato that's going to get tall, support it so that it's not laying on the ground. And the only reason for that, by the way, is to keep the tomatoes off the ground, so that, well, there are a couple reasons. The tomatoes off the ground so that slugs, snails, earwigs, that sort of thing don't start eating them as readily. But also contact of the leaves with the soil is probably not the best arrangement because of the possible transmission of funguses. So it's good to keep them up in the air. And we'll talk about supports here very soon. Now, tomatoes are like these little tomatoes are probably started right in the pot here. And the reason I say that, and I actually don't know for sure, but when a plant starts to grow from seed, it puts out cotyledons, which are the first leaves, and you can see they don't look like the tomato leaves. They're just these little simple leaves, and they're up above the soil level. So this was just started right in the pot, and I'm going to take it out of the pot like that, so that we can see the roots. It's filled out the pot very nicely with the roots. But tomatoes are one of the plants, there are many, but one of the plants that has the ability to grow new roots out of the stem, the main stem. And you probably can't see it on the camera, but there are little tiny hairs all along the main stem, and each of those little hairs is potentially a root. So I just took off the cotyledon leaf, and when I plant a tomato seedling like this, I usually remove 2 true leaves, the complex leaves like this, 2 of them, and then I plant it down in the ground so the soil level is up here. And that's even true if it's a tall one like this. This one's already had a couple of leaves removed, so I would plant it about that deep so the soil level is about here. And then you'll get nice new root growth out of the stem that's underground. There's no point in going much more than 2 leaves. There have been a lot of experiments with that, and you don't get much more in the way of roots after you bury more than 2 leaves. But make sure you remove the leaves so that the plant gets the message, basically, that it's supposed to grow roots in that part of the stem. It's always a good idea to, you can see how the roots have grown out to where the edge of the container was, and then they couldn't go any farther. So they've conformed themselves to the shape of the pot. So it's always a good idea to loosen up the roots a little bit. And you can see, yes, I am breaking the roots a little bit. But I'm doing 2 things. I'm breaking the roots so they'll have to branch out and grow into the soil that I'm going to plant this in.
And I'm also making a lot more surface area in the edge of this root ball so that the new soil that I'm going to put this in will integrate with this old soil that's around the root. So I can do a little bit on the bottom too. And so with just about anything I plant, I rough up the root ball like that so that it's not kind of stuck to the shape of the can or the little container, the pot that it was growing in. This is true if you're growing something at home and you want to transplant it from one pot into another. Doesn't mean you have to really mangle it, although a lot of them can handle mangling. Tomatoes don't like their roots mangled, so be a little bit gentle with them. And then we'll plant one of these here shortly, so that we can see how that is done.
Which one is that you do?
This one is this is one I'm going to try this year. Barred boar, the B-O-A-R, like a pig, and barred as in it has barred. It's red with kind of yellow stripes.
Oh, cool.
And it is a big one. So I don't know how it's going to work for me, but it looks really pretty. So this year, my experiments are going to be with barred boar and with some of the heirloom marriage hybrids and see how they work. I'll grow some here in Mill Valley, and I'll grow some at home in Fairfax, where it's a little warmer, and see how they do and report back next year. Now, there are always new tomatoes every year. I try not to go crazy bringing every new tomato that's available there. This year, for instance, there are probably 15 dwarf varieties of tomatoes suddenly available this year. And they're kind of neat because they make a compact plant that you can grow in a small container. So for apartment dwellers or people who have to grow on a relatively limited deck or something like that, you can grow several varieties in smaller containers where maybe you would have had to devote, a big pot, a single pot to one variety before. And so I've got in one called dwarf green zebra this year, and I'll get some more in too, but it looks like a green zebra tomato, which is a really pretty, it ripens green, although it's somewhat sweet. It's not as sweet as tomato can get, but it's not a sour tomato. But it's a very compact looking little plant. On the tags, you'll see two terms that will tell you about or maybe three actually, that'll tell you about the size the tomato is going to get. Most tomatoes are what we call indeterminate, which means indeterminate. I don't know how big it's going to get. It's indeterminate. It just means it keeps growing. And it keeps growing and it keeps producing fruit as it grows. It keeps branching out, the suckers or branches, and will give you fruit all through the season. A determinate tomato, on the other hand, has what I'll call a predetermined size. It branches, grows up, flowers kind of all at once in a more compact form. They were developed principally for machine picking, paste tomatoes in the Central Valley, so that they would all ripen at once. And then you could go through with a machine and then throw them in those trucks if you've ever driven around in the valley, and there'll be the tomato trucks driving around and spilling tomatoes all over the freeway exits as they go around things. But they just grow tons and tons and tons of these tomatoes, and if they all ripen at once, then that's fabulous. Well, in home gardens, that can be good if you want to make a whole bunch of tomato sauce and freeze it or something like that, or you want to can tomatoes. But for most people eating fresh tomatoes, you're probably going to prefer an indeterminate tomato, so that you can keep picking them all through the season. There's a third kind of tomato that is called semi-determinate or semi-indeterminate. It's somewhere in between. So it's a little more compact, but it will keep going all season. And I think Abe Lincoln is a good example of that. It's kind of a medium red, nice tomato, but it's a little more compact, and it's kind of an in-betweener. Now, tomatoes require full sun. What is full sun? It means the middle of the day full sun, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. That's a full day of sun. They don't really care about before 10 a.m. They don't really care about after 4 p.m. So try to find your nice sunny spot. At the beginning of the season, now when it's cool, if you can give them a south exposure with maybe a wall or the house behind them to reflect some heat, they'll appreciate that. And that will also radiate some heat out during the night, so that they aren't as cold during the night, and they'll grow better. They need decent drainage. So if you have an area of your garden where water has been puddling during the winter storms, that's probably not the best place to grow the tomatoes. Although I have accidentally planted them where the drainage was close to zero, and at least for a while they thrive on that. But as a rule of thumb, you want decent drainage. And then lots of organic matter in the soil. Whether your soil is sandy because you're, in the avenues in San Francisco, or whether it's heavy clay or anything in between, add organic matter to it, mix it in well. That can be compost. It can be a planting mix. It can be compost with some manure. And manure can either be composted, the EV stone chicken manure, for instance, that floats cells, is composted, which means it's been processed at relatively high temperature, and you don't need to worry about pathogens in it, which is nice. Otherwise, if you put manure in, you should wait at least a month before you plant in a soil that has fresh manure in it. Whether if you get horse manure from a friend who has a horse or something like that, yeah, let it mature for a while. For plants like tomatoes, where you're not actually eating the plant that's in the ground, but the fruit, a month is fine. If you're going to grow lettuce or something like that in fresh manure, you want to wait 3 months before you are going to plant that. But the composted manure is good to use. And there's also, if you just need a small amount of manure because you're growing a few plants, this Espoma chicken manure product is pretty amazing. It's a nicely balanced fertilizer. By that I mean all things that are sold as fertilizer have to have a guaranteed analysis. This one says 5, 3, 2. That means 5% nitrogen, 3% phosphorus, 2% potash, which is potassium, basically. And numbers that aren't like 5, 0, 1, but are 5, 3, 2 are relatively balanced. That you've got some of each nutrient, macronutrient in there. This is also a pelletized dry form of chicken manure that it's competitively priced, and I kind of like it. We've been selling it for quite a while, but I only recognize relatively recently that it's actually a nicely balanced fertilizer. What it lacks No, I take it back. It doesn't lack. I thought it lacked calcium, but it doesn't. Any fertilizer you use for tomatoes, you want to make sure has at least 3% calcium in it. This has 8% calcium in it. The EB Stone tomato vegetable food has 3% calcium. That's the minimum. Calcium is necessary to prevent what we call blossom end rot on tomatoes. Blossom end rot looks like a kind of gray scab on one side of the tomato, and it's just because the tomato isn't having enough calcium from the soil, or it's not using it adequately yet because the temperature is too cold. So making sure that your fertilizer has some calcium in it will at least assure that it's available. Usually blossom end rot only happens at the beginning of the season for most people. So it's not something to panic about. It's disappointing because it makes a really ugly tomato and only half of it will be edible. But it usually will go away on its own. There is a calcium spray that I don't know why it's effective, but it seems to be effective. The methodology of spraying it on the leaves and having the plant absorb it isn't supposed to work. But at least anecdotally it seems to. So that's something you can try if you have any problem with blossom end rot. But if you've got the calcium in the ground, you can be fairly confident that it will be a temporary problem. So make sure you add organic matter at the time you plant. If you're planting in containers, as many of us do, use a good quality potting soil. I use the slope organic potting soil, and I add fertilizer to it. I add either Sure Start is really good to add. It's loaded with beneficial bacteria and fungi that the plants need. The tomato vegetable food has those as well, and it's excellent. So in a container that's a small container that I might use as the first step when I buy my 3.5 inch or 4 inch tomato, which I have loosened up and prepared to be transplanted. I might go to a 1 gallon size container first. The advantage to a smaller container than a gigantic one is that it can warm up each day. The roots will warm up. And so I'll be right back, Jen. I'm just going to grab another one here to transfer soil back and forth. And I'm just going to show you. I said that I wanted to bury this a little bit so that the 2 leaves that I pinched off will be covered. The places where I pinched them off will be covered so that it can grow more roots from the stem. So I'm removing enough soil from this one container that when I fill it back up with soil, it'll be at the right height. And I'm going to add a little bit of fertilizer to the container. And I do this kind of Julia Child style. So this is about a tablespoon or a little more of fertilizer, and I'm going to just mix it in a little bit and make a nice spot for my tomato to sit, and then it'll sit down low enough that when I well add a little sauce here to the soil that I'm going to put around it. So when I fill up the can now, it'll be at the right height.
Do you ever add the fertilizer after you plant it, or you always recommend mixing it? with
Well,
the
I do
soil?
fertilize later in the season, but the fertilizer does the best job if you can get it down where the roots are.
Mhm.
So there we have filled around so that it can make some new roots, and then this is really important step. Put the label back in with
Yeah.
it so that you know what the tomato is. Because if you have good success, you're going to want to get one of that same variety the next year. And if you don't, or you don't like the tomato, then you're going to want to know what not to buy next year. And it doesn't do you any good to come in and say, Dan, I had this great tomato last year. It was, it was red and it was about that big. You go, well, okay, well, good. Which one was it? Anyway, so this 1 gallon size is excellent to move your little tomatoes up into for about a month. And then they'll get to be something more like this size. This is a 1 gallon plant that was grown in Ripen, California, down in the Central Valley, down toward Fresno, and probably in a greenhouse. You know, these are pretty strong looking plants, and they're conventionally grown. They're not organically grown. And this is a pretty good deal because I'm betting, I haven't looked, but I'm going to look now with you. I think if we take this out of the can, we're going to be able to just really easily separate these two plants and end up with 2 tomato plants instead of 1 for the price of, well, 2 for the price of 1, right?
Mhm.
So let's just see what happens here. I'm going to take my trusty pruning shears and just
Ouch, that's when the plant says ouch.
plants not single.
Hey there, Dan. While you're working on a tomato, can I ask you a couple questions?
Fire away.
Yeah. It's actually kind of talking about dealing with cutting into the plants as well. You were mentioning a little bit more earlier about removing suckers, and someone had a question about removing suckers on mature plants, and just do you have a recommendation for that, or if it's a smart idea, or how would you approach it?
You know, by the time the plants are mature, the suckers have become full-fledged members of the community. They are branches that are bearing tomatoes, and there's absolutely no reason to take them off unless they're growing in a spot where you don't want them to grow. So for instance, let's go over here, Jen. These separated just fine.
Yeah, they did.
So I'm just going to stick this guy in here so he doesn't fall over. But the technique for planting this guy would be just the same. Pinch off these bottom leaves to about there, and then bury him deep enough that the soil level is right here. Add fertilizer, and this is a 15 gallon container, which is about 2 cubic feet of soil, and that's just the right size for 1 tomato plant. That's going to get full sized. So I'm going to, if I can get it out of this, there we go. I'm going to put it down here where you can see the scale a little better. So I'm just going to bury this guy in here, and I'll probably replant him and put him a little deeper in a little bit.
Mhm.
But I wanted to show you some supports. This tomato cage right here is sort of the most basic kind of support for tomatoes. You see how the legs are bent in, so you need to just kind of bend them straight like that, and then you turn it over because the prongy things are always going to go in the ground. and stick it in while the plant is nice and young. And then it'll grow up, and you have to feed them a little bit to keep them inside the cage as they grow, and keep it nicely supported and symmetrical within the cage, and it does a great job. Once the plant is bigger, it's really difficult to put the cage on without breaking the plant. That can be very frustrating, but you can, I didn't bring any sticks, but you can get those little bamboo stakes. They're a little thicker than a pencil, but they can be 4 feet tall or even 6 feet tall. But just stick them in, maybe 4 of them around the plant, and then use some twine or the plastic tie tape and tie it to the sticks around the plant, and you'll build the cage that way around it without breaking it. But the easiest way to deal with them is to get the cage on at the time you plant. It'll grow up into the cage. These square cages are cool because at the end of the season, they'll fold flat and you can put them away, and they don't take up any room, whereas these guys take up some room, but they stack inside each other. Okay, so that's support is important for the indeterminate type of tomatoes. I fertilize usually after the first tomatoes have set, so there will be flowers, and then the little tomatoes will be visible about the size of a grape or smaller. And that's the time that I add fertilizer again after my initial fertilizing at the time of planting. And then in a container, about every 2 to 3 weeks after that, and in the ground about once a month for additional fertilizer. In the ground, you want to water deeply. Tomatoes are capable of having very deep roots. In a container, you'll find as the summer wears on that you will eventually have to water daily as the roots fill the pot up and the plant gets big. It'll take all the water you can give it, basically. It's best to water in a way that doesn't splash water and soil up onto the leaves, so try to keep the water down low. Don't hose the leaves. If you can water in the morning so that things have dried out by evening, that's a good idea. That will help prevent fungal diseases. Drip irrigation is fine, but you have to check your drip irrigation and make sure that it's putting the water where you want it to go and the water's not running off in some other direction. But drip irrigation will work.
I have a question about temperature you were talking about a little bit earlier. And they were asking about how to compensate for cooler nights. I actually had a couple of questions about dealing with keeping your tomatoes a little bit warmer, and what are some tricks or tips about kind of heat?
Well, there are a number of techniques. I mentioned a south-facing wall will reflect heat during the day, during the springtime when it's still not very hot. It'll also absorb heat and radiate it back out at night. Similarly, even a concrete patio can do that. It can absorb quite a bit of heat during the day and then radiate it back out and keep things warmer at night. There are things like water collars that you can put around them. I'm not sure how effective that really is, but they exist.
I've also heard about using the black containers or the plastic pots can help with that too, right?
Black containers will help warm up the soil during the day. Black plastic mulch can do that to a certain extent in the soil. And actually they found that red plastic mulch is very effective for tomatoes. I don't know where you can find red plastic mulch, but or red plastic sheeting. We've never had it available here, but apparently experiments have shown that it's very effective. I don't mulch heavily yet. The soil is still very cool, and so you want the soil to warm up during the day, and a heavy layer of mulch will just keep the soil very cold and wet. So if you're going to put the tomatoes in the ground, keep mulch away from them for a while until the soil starts to dry out, and then is a good time to mulch to keep the moisture in. Yeah, it's a little difficult to fool Mother Nature or to fool the tomatoes about Mother Nature. They're going to survive fine at this point. We're not going to have any more frost, in spite of the frost warning that we got from North Bay valleys yesterday or the day before. That maybe Sonoma got a little frost, but certainly Marin didn't. I think, you know, putting the small tomatoes into a little larger container is probably your best way to get them going in spite of the cool April temperatures. And then transplant them into the ground or into the big container in about a month after they've grown up to something more this size or bigger. And then they're going to just be that much more muscular, and the temperatures are going to be that much better. So that's really the best way to go. And most of them, I try to curate the tomatoes somewhat. I don't load us up here with gigantic tomatoes that are really designed to grow in the South or something like that, so that people are going to have a bad experience with. If you get the right tomatoes for the right climate, you can grow tomatoes almost anywhere that isn't freezing. But you have to accept that we really don't have a climate in the Bay Area that is really good for gigantic tomatoes. I mean, that's just a fact of life. But we can get just as much flavor out of a slightly smaller tomato. If you like the kind of flavor of a black crim or a Cherokee purple tomato, which are wonderful. Their Petaluma Hill Purple is a smaller, dark tomato that has that same kind of flavor profile and is much easier to grow. Black crim is easier to grow than Cherokee purple. And it's really just a matter of the size of the ultimate tomato and how many days it takes to ripen it. And there's a big difference between 80 days and 100 days, trust me. In reality, it's almost a month difference. That 20 days with stoppage time translates into at least a month. So be a little bit strategic about how you go about it, and have a variety of, if you have the luxury of being able to have several plants, get different varieties. Always get a cherry tomato, get a small slicer, and get something bigger, and you'll see what works best. Now, before we sign off here, we've got to talk just a little about grafted tomatoes, because they're becoming very popular for good reason. A grafted tomato is similar to any fruit tree that you would buy, an apple, say. An apple is a Granny Smith apple is the Granny Smith part of the apple is grafted onto a rootstock that has a name like M111 or something like that. And the rootstock is an apple that's grown to have a strong root system that's disease resistant and can handle different soils. And then the Granny Smith, which has been selected over eons to be that nice tart Granny Smith apple, is grafted onto that rootstock. And again, this is not GMO, this is just grafting one genetic apple onto another. The rootstock keeps its genes, the Granny Smith keeps its genes, and you get a strong Granny Smith apple tree because you've got a nice strong rootstock, where the Granny Smith rootstock would not be as strong. Same with tomatoes. They've developed rootstock tomatoes. So they grow up the rootstock tomato, looks just like a tomato. And then they have grown a Berkeley tie-dye tomato from seed. And they chop off the Berkeley tie-dye tomato and they chop off the rootstock tomato and put the Berkeley tie-dye on the stem and clip them together until they grow together. And we can see right here, there's kind of a scar and you can see how this one's more green and then this one's more purple. And that's where the graft is. And so everything above the graft is Berkeley tie-dye. Everything below the graft is the rootstock. And I have no idea what the names of tomato rootstocks are, but probably something like XZR 50/5. And it's important. I mean, it's going to cost you $14.99 for this tomato instead of $4.99. But you're going to get a tomato that's large, but has better ability to grow in different temperatures and in different soils than a seedling tomato would. And so it's important when you plant it that we not plant it deep the way we did this seedling and bury the leaves, because we want this graft to be above ground. We don't want roots growing out of the Berkeley tie-dye. We only want the roots from the tougher rootstock. So this is the exception to the bury them deep. When you buy a grafted tomato, you want that graft to be up above the ground so that you're not getting roots out of the whatever it is, the Brandywine or the Berkeley tie-dye. But I highly recommend that if you're going to get a big tomato, that is, the fruit is going to be big and it's going to take a long time to mature, try a grafted tomato. The feedback we've been having is excellent on them. People are coming back for more the next year. And so I take that as a strong recommendation that they're going to do well. And the ones that I've grown here in our demonstration barrel have done very well.
Wow, that's very interesting. I didn't know too much about the grafted tomatoes. I'm gonna have to try one out. I have maybe like one or two quick questions we can go before we end today. And I want to again thank everyone for watching today, as well as asking many questions and being very a lot of participation, which is really nice to see. Just a little bit of a quick talk about companion planting or what other plants you can plant with your tomato, especially in those larger containers while they're, you know, on the smaller side too.
Well, fortunately, tomatoes can be grown with almost anything else, and including onions, and things like onions, garlic, chives will help to confuse some of the insects that fly in. Growing flowers like alyssum is a great idea because they attract beneficial insects. And that can be helpful. The good news, there's good news and bad news with the companion planting. The good news is that while that can help with the insects, around here, we don't have huge insect problems with tomatoes usually. The biggest problems we might have is with a tomato hornworm. I don't know if you've ever seen one, but they're about huge. They're a big green caterpillar about this long and as thick as your finger. And they eat the tomatoes. You will pick a tomato and half of it will be gone, and sometimes the tomato hornworm will be right there on the tomato. Well, the companion planting probably isn't going to do anything about that. They're the larva of the tomato moth, which is a great big moth, and probably is going to fly in at night whether you've got companion plants there or not. But you will get lots of, if you grow onions and garlic, you'll get lots of onions and garlic, and that'll be a good thing. The bad news is really that it doesn't do anything really for fungal diseases. And they're the biggest culprits with tomatoes. So good hygiene is a good idea. If again, getting rid of sick plants, taking leaves off that seem to be yellowing and dying, but don't have any other obvious pathogenic problems is a good idea. Never put your tomato plants in your home compost. Always put them in the green can so they can be composted at high temperature and get rid of any funguses or bacteria that were growing in them. You probably don't have hot enough compost at home to be able to do that successfully. So put them in the green can, and keep your mulch a little bit away from the stem. And that way it'll be easier to keep slugs, snails, earwigs. You'll be able to see them if they're there. If you pile the mulch up around, they'll often be under the mulch and you won't even know they're there. It also, I don't know, a lot of places around here at least have problems with voles, a little mouse-like creature. And the more mulch you have, the more places you have for the voles to hide. And so sometimes mulch is a problem. I'm all in favor of mulch in general, but if you're having vole problems, if you're having a lot of snail and slug problems, it's often a good idea to get rid of the mulch, at least for a while, so that you can get those things under control and then slowly put the mulch back. You'll be able to still grow the tomatoes without the mulch. So, yeah.
Very nice.